Good morning, everyone. I'm Anshul Chaudhary. I'm a senior consultant here at Biologics Consulting. I focus on medical device and combination product development. And as Nicholas mentioned, today we'll be discussing human factors in combination product development. So first off, what is human factors or usability engineering? So one of the definitions I've seen is it's the application of knowledge regarding human behavior, abilities, and limitations to a product design to minimize use-related risks or increase safety, achieve effective performance, and ensure a user-centered design. So just some examples of human factors activities to give you more of a sense of what that definition means is, for example, you may use what's called anthropometric data, data about human dimensions or motion or strength to develop product requirements, for example, cap opening force requirement. Or you see there that there's a particular risk with the device use or product use, for example, needle stick with an injection device. So a needle safety guard is used to prevent that use-related risk. So the first thing when considering human factors in the product design is to define the use environment, the user group or groups, and assess the user interface. So the use environment includes the location, such as the home, hospital, or clinic, but it also includes things like the amount of light or noise that's present in the user's environment. The user or users could be physicians, nurses, patients, or caregivers. And each type of user brings their own prior knowledge and expectations to the product. So FDA, really likes to make sure that you're looking at each user group and how each user group uses a product. Finally, the user interface is really kind of mainly what you see and touch and feel. So it includes things like buttons on the device, display screens, alarms, as well as the packaging and labeling. So it's important to remember that the user will be interacting with not just the product itself, but also the packaging and the labeling. And all these things impact product use, the use environment, users, user interface, all kind of determine whether the product use ends up being safe and effective or there's a use error. So this slide just shows some combination product examples, and so you can see that the user interface for different combination products can be vastly different. And the considerations and risks, for example, for injection devices administered by a healthcare provider are going to be quite different than those for an inhaled product used by a patient in their own home. So human factors engineering is closely tied to risk and with the goal of eliminating or minimizing risks, specifically use-related risks. So to assess the use-related risks, FDA expects sponsors to conduct a use-related risk analysis. This is a key step in a human factors program and really should be done for all combination products. The URRA analyzes each user task and identifies the potential use errors and hazards associated with that task. And based on the severity of the potential hazards that are identified, you can then determine if there are any critical tasks that exist. So critical tasks are tasks that could be associated with harm if they're not performed properly. If there are critical tasks, it is likely that a human factor study is needed. There are, certain cases where if critical tasks could exist, but you may not need to do a human factor study, but you would likely still want to kind of get that buy-in that not conducting the study is acceptable. And really the only times you see that a human factor study isn't needed when there's critical tasks identified is if there's trained medical professionals who are the only users, and the device is, the design of the product is something that's really very commonly used, and hasn't really changed too much from something that's already, already on the market. And even if there are not critical tasks identified, any potential use errors and hazards that are identified as part of the risk analysis URA, those errors or hazards need to be mitigated to the extent possible with risk control measures. So for example, kind of going back to the needle stick injection device, if you have a needle stick that is going to, is a hazard, the addition of a needle safety guard is a common risk control measure. So this slide shows a URA example. It's taken from FDA's draft guidance on URAs for drugs, biologics, and combination products. This is the format that FDA expects sponsors to submit their URA in, and they are pretty particular about using this format. So the first column is the number of the task, followed by the user task description. And then based on that user task description, you would look at what are the associated potential use errors with the specific task. So in this example, if the user does not pull the cap off initially, there may be a delay in administration of therapy. So that is the hazard associated with the potential use error. You'll also want to assess the severity of that potential harm. How serious is it if there is a delay in administration of therapy? In this case, a delay in therapy is noted to not be a significant hazard, so it is not considered a critical task. But again, we still want to determine if we can put any risk control measures in place. In this case, it's noted that the product has been designed with a pull force that's appropriate for the user population and the use environment. And finally, FDA is going to want to understand how your risk control measures have been evaluated for effectiveness. So even if the task is not critical, if you are doing a human factor study, you may still want to assess the risk control measures of all tasks. So I wanted to kind of go back to the definition of critical task. It is considered to be a user task that if it is performed incorrectly or not performed at all, would or could cause harm to the patient or user, where harm is defined to include compromised medical care. And it's important to note that this definition is for combination products, and the critical task definition differs for combination products and versus devices. For devices, critical tasks are defined as tasks that, if performed incorrectly, could cause serious harm. But for combination products, since medication errors are also considered, it was determined that a task associated with any level of harm is considered a critical task. So I've included here 2 examples of critical tasks that are also taken from another FDA draft guidance. This draft guidance is for human factor studies for combination products. The first example is related to an injection device where the task is holding the injector or syringe in the correct orientation. The possible use errors here are holding the injector or syringe incorrectly or injecting upside down. And if those use errors occur, there are potential hazards or harms. For example, the needle stick injuries, delay of therapy, or reduced drug efficacy. And because the potential hazards or harms exist, it is considered a critical task. So in the second example, this is for an inhaled product. The user task is priming the product. And if the user doesn't prime the product or doesn't prime it properly, under or overdosing could occur. If there's a capsule, choking could occur, or a missed dose could occur. And again, because there is a hazard or harm associated with the use error, it's considered a critical task. So now let's assume that you've identified critical tasks and your product design is not that common. So you decided that a human factors study, human factors testing is going to be needed for your product. So you'll first want to consider formative studies, really hopefully early on in product development. Formative studies are typically done to evaluate product prototypes and ensure that that risk mitigation measures that you've put in place are appropriate. When considering the risks and risk mitigation measures, you should also look into use problems with similar products to yours to see how you can mitigate any known use problems. Formative studies allow also for identification of problems prior to finalizing a product design. And it's often an iterative process where you identify problems, make design changes to solve those problems, and then retest to see if issues have been resolved and no new use-related issues have come up. Formative study results are also often useful in developing final instructions for use and training programs if a training program is determined to be needed. So after formative studies are completed and you've locked in your device design, you'll need to conduct a human factors study, summative or validation study. Now, again, I just want to repeat that a validation study is only really required if critical tasks have been identified with the product and your exact device design has not been previously or commonly used. And I say this because these tests are quite expensive, and so you likely will not want to conduct them if you don't really need to. But assuming that it is needed, a human factors summative or validation testing is expected to be done on the final finished product user interface. And this means that not just your product design, but also your packaging and your labeling are in final or at least near final form. If you've determined that there are significant use-related risks, you may also decide that a user training program is needed for use with your combination product. And that training program needs to be validated as part of the human factors summative study as well. Most of the time, your summative study will be a simulated use study where you're replicating use scenarios and the environment of use rather than actually using the product on a real patient. And biologics, we often work closely with the companies that conduct the human factors studies to help ensure that the study protocol is in alignment with FDA requirements. Some of those requirements are that all critical tasks need to be evaluated with all user groups, and that at least 15 users per user group are tested. So for example, if your product is going to be used in a hospital setting by both physicians and nurses, both a physician user group is needed and a nurse user group is needed, just because the different knowledge and training backgrounds of these different user groups. It's expected that the human factors validation study will be designed so that performance and, if needed, user comprehension can be assessed. So in terms of user comprehension, if it's determined that understanding something in the labeling is a critical task, you'll want to do a knowledge task study as part of your validation study. And this kind of helps assess if your labeling is properly understood by users. And that's something else that we can work, we work oftentimes with sponsors on. In addition to that knowledge task study, a lot of times the study will, last part of the study will end with asking for self-reported feedback from users to understand, did they think that the product was easy to use, and that can be valuable, but it's sometimes not accurate, because sometimes we see users, study participants say, oh yeah, that was super easy to use, I had no problems, but in actuality, they didn't use the product correctly. So the self-reported feedback is good to collect, but can often need to be taken with a grain of salt. Finally, FDA is going to expect that all use errors and close calls be investigated to identify the root cause and determine whether any additional measures need to be taken to mitigate hazards. So hopefully at this summative validation stage, you don't see too many use errors or close calls, but any that occur need to be thoroughly investigated. If additional measures do end up being needed to mitigate risk, FDA will often say, well, okay, that's a sign that a human factors, your validation study has failed, and you would need to make changes and then repeat the study. That is definitely something we want to avoid. It's, again, a part of why the formative studies are so important, and we can often try to put together justifications for why repeat studying may not need to be done. So now let's talk about what the human factors requirements are at different stages of the development process. So if you're at an opening IND stage, a phase 1 study, or you're starting a phase 2 study, you usually only need a URA and a high-level plan, meaning, okay, you've done your use-related risk assessment and you've assessed if there are not any critical tasks, and based on that, you've decided whether or not you will be conducting a human factors validation study or not. And if you are not, then you need a justification for why you wouldn't be conducting the study if there are any critical tasks identified. At this stage, if you have done any formative human factors tests, a summary of those is nice to include. It's not a requirement, but it's nice to include. It's also nice to share any changes that have been made to the user interface based on these results, so that the agency can see that you are taking human factors into account and have made changes to your product to kind of address things that you've already noticed. So at phase 3, that's when you're really getting to, you're going to want to study your final product for your clinical study, as well as think about seriously start thinking about your summative or validation human factors study. So it's recommended that you initiate that summative human factors study, ideally prior to the phase 3 study, but it can oftentimes be done in parallel with the phase 3 study. Most of the time, we see that it ends up being done in parallel with phase 3 studies. The reason I say, ideally it's done prior or initiated at least prior is that if you do end up seeing significant issues or things that require another design change, that can be addressed, relatively early on in your phase 3 study, so that you still are gathering clinical evidence on your to be marketed product. Another thing to consider is that ideally the HF validation test protocol should be submitted to FDA for review. And along with the protocol, you can include the proposed final labeling. And it's really, as early as you can submit to FDA, the better, because their review of human factors test protocols often ends up taking quite a while. So you don't want that to be a factor that delays the development process. So how do you then go about obtaining FDA feedback on your human factors program? So it's important to note FDA no longer is providing feedback on human factors questions as part of type B, C, or D meetings. They will, if you ask a question related to human factors in your meeting request letter or briefing package, they will usually tell you to submit that separately in a human factors submission. So typically the URA and or the human factors validation study protocol is submitted in what they call a human factors submission to the IND, and it's reviewed by DMEPA, or the Division of Medication Error and Prevention Analysis. Product samples need to be submitted to FDA as part of that human factors submission. And there's guidance documents that let you know where exactly to submit the product samples and which address. As I mentioned, obtaining feedback on the human factors program can often take time. There is a PDUFA goal for FDA to provide feedback on human factors submissions within 60 days of receipt, but this goal is often missed. I've seen it take anywhere from 2 months to a year to get feedback on a human factors protocol. So again, that's why it's best to submit as early as possible. slide. So now that you've completed your clinical study and if you're getting ready for marketing, at the marketing submission stage, BLA or NDA stage, again, you're going to want to resubmit your URRA, your final version. You're going to want to submit your summative, your validation testing report, and you'll also want to submit a human factors summary report, which kind of summarizes your overall human factors program. It should include summaries of the formative studies that were conducted, any changes that were made on your device through development, and then a brief summary of your summative study as well. Next slide. So some common pitfalls when it comes to human factors in combination products. Again, I mentioned not submitting the human factors validation study protocol to FDA early enough, which can kind of delay getting started or kind of force you to get the study started without receiving FDA's feedback. Sometimes sponsors will propose conducting a human factors study outside the US. That's typically not agreeable to FDA because they want to see that the user population in the US is represented, and oftentimes there are differences such as differences in the diversity of the US population, the training and knowledge of US users versus OUS users, and even the use environment itself. So sometimes the hospitals, OUS versus in the US, may, have something in the environment that FDA is going to pick on and say, well, we really think that you should conduct this study in the US. So it's best to conduct your human factors studies in the US if you're planning on submitting to FDA for US marketing approval. Another, common thing that we see is design changes that are made after the human factors validation study is complete. If the changes impact a critical task or could potentially introduce a new hazard, FDA is going to come back and say, well, now you need a new validation study. So occasionally it's possible to justify not doing that new study, but it is something to consider that you really want to, as much as possible, try to have a locked-in design before you start that human factors validation study. So next, I just wanted to touch upon threshold analyses. This is really for generic drug products. So generic drug products being developed with a unique device component or slightly modified device component compared to an RLD product can have just a comparative analysis done. And that can be submitted to FDA, and FDA calls these comparative analyses threshold analyses to see if they meet the threshold for needing a human factor study or not. So in these threshold analyses, you'll want to include a labeling comparison between the RLD label and the proposed product label, a comparative task analysis, kind of going through each individual step and the instructions for use between both products, a physical comparison of the device constituent. So this is where you will want to make your own assessment of whether there's any physical differences between the proposed product and the RLD. And you'll also need to submit product samples to FDA so that FDA can make their own assessment. And then the determination of differences. If there are any differences that are identified, you will need to categorize them as being minor or not. Anything that's not considered minor is considered an other difference. If there are other differences that exist, comparative use human factor study may be needed, where you do a study with the user group, intended user groups, and have them use both the RLD and the proposed product and see if there's any differences in the ability of subjects to use the two products, if there's any use errors that come up with the proposed product that didn't show up with the RLD. So in conclusion, assessing the need for human factor studies is really a crucial consideration for combination product program. To determine the need for a human factor study, you'll need to do a URRA or use-related risk analysis to see if critical tasks exist. If they do, then human factors testing should be considered. Formative testing should always be done prior to summative testing. Summative testing, human factors test protocols should ideally be reviewed by FDA prior to study conduct. Summative testing should be initiated once the device design, user interface is frozen. And the summative testing report will need to be included, submitted to FDA at the NDA BLA stage. So with that, I will go ahead and take any questions.
There's a question or request. If you could please show the phase 2 again.
Sure. Nicholas, I may need your help getting back there.
Sure.
So yeah, for phases 1 and 2, you'll want to have your URA included within the IND submission and outline your high-level human factors plan, whether or not you want to do a study or not, or plan to do a study or not. And I'll just mention, while we're waiting for other questions, so clearly this was focused mainly on FDA requirements. In the EU, human factors is also required. IEC 62366 is the standard that's followed. In the US, FDA expects not just IEC 62366 to be followed, but all that information that's included within the guidance and draft guidance documents, specifically that URA needs to be there and it needs to be in that specific format that they ask for. All right, well, Nicholas, I think we usually try to make these slides available to the participants after the webinar, right?
Exactly. You will receive an email with the recording and also the previous webinars, so you can set them off if you prefer. And of course, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out, Anshul. We will send you contact directly as well after this session. So thank you all for your attendance, for your time, and hope to see you in the next time.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
good day,
you.
everybody.